Hello, today is Friday, March 10th, 2023. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. Washington, D.C. continues to be a hotbed of partisanship, and that unfortunately has led to fights over just about every issue you can imagine. This gridlock in our federal government does have a downstream effect on the market for ICT services. Paralyzed government regulation and decision-making impacts the competitive choices of services and providers available to enterprises. It slows down the cycle of innovation that leads to technological advancements. And of course, it also hits the bottom line prices that end users ultimately have to pay for their services. Does that by raising the cost borne by businesses to support certain government programs, most notably the Universal Service Fund, or USF. On today's podcast, I'm joined by Andrew Brown, the managing partner of LB3, and Andrew is also the chairman of TC2, and Sara Crifasi, counsel at LB3. In addition to their work negotiating ICT deals on behalf of LB3 and TC2's clients, Andrew and Sara are also deeply involved in policy and regulatory issues that affect enterprise customers and their purchases of ICT services. We are going to discuss the current environment in Washington, D.C., and how it affects the products and services that our clients purchase. Hey, Andrew and Sara, thank you both for joining me from the nation's capital.
Hey, Joe. Very glad to be here with you on this Friday morning.
Yeah, great to be here with you, Joe.
So we're in D.C. and we're sort of talking politics with you today, but we promise not to scream at you or get too worked up the way people here seem to. We're going to keep it very professional.
Well, I appreciate that civility, Andrew. So what is going on down there in Washington, and how does it affect the things that we care about?
Well, I think you have to start from the place that for a lot of us that deal with telecom and technology policy and regulation, the hyper-partisan environment that we're living through right now is relatively new and it's a little bit odd. I mean, the issues that we care about are kind of obscure and historically they haven't been that controversial or contentious outside of a very small group of industry players and consumer advocates. But over the last handful of years, every issue, every regulation, every agency has become controversial and partisan, and that has bled into the telecom and technology policymaking space as well.
Andrew, how are you seeing that gridlock and partisanship actually play out?
Well, you can start with the organization and administration of the Federal Communications Commission itself, which is the government agency we care about the most, given the market we operate in. You know, the FCC is an independent expert agency, which means it's not, in theory, controlled by Congress or the executive branch. It's supposed to have 5 commissioners, 3 that are from the same party as the current president and 2 from the other party, to give representation across the political spectrum. What we're seeing fairly recently is that the issues the commission has to address have become very contentious among the commissioners. Very partisan and wrapped up in a much broader and kind of toxic national political dynamic. And, that resulted in a lot of regulations or rules or policies ultimately being adopted or rejected on these 3-2 party line votes. And that is back when the commission actually had a full roster of commissioners. And when you see a lot of those 3-2 votes, that's a pretty good indication that there's not a lot of cooperation and consensus being built.
Yeah, that's right. And going back a couple of years now, the situation has gone from those contentious 3-2 votes to gridlocked 2-2 votes or even no votes because, as Andrew alluded, there's not even a full roster of commissioners anymore. There have only been 4 commissioners for a while now, which means that the current chair either can't move on controversial issues because she doesn't have a working majority to get them passed, or she has to spend a lot of time on non-controversial issues that she knows she can get through, which means at the end of the day that the commission just isn't doing much right now.
So why isn't the commission fully staffed?
Well, wait for it, because of politics and partisanship. The president nominated a 5th commissioner, but the Senate confirmation process became very heated and personal, and her nomination languished for something like 16 months without the Senate even ever voting on it. And Just this week, she finally withdrew from consideration because it was increasingly clear that they weren't going to consent to the nomination.
And it's really a shame in this case because it shouldn't have taken as long as it did to get to this result. And during that period, a lot of important issues were put on hold. And now the process has to start all over again with a new nominee. And what was interesting and unfortunate about this latest confirmation process was that the nominee was pretty atypical for the commission. She came from a place of really deep knowledge and understanding of issues from the consumer's perspective, including business customers, rather than from the regulated provider's view of the world. She really promoted a competition-first agenda, and we may have lost that when this nomination was pulled.
That is a shame. So, Andrew, what are some of the issues that affect enterprise customers that haven't gotten the attention they need?
Well, the most obvious one is USF, which you mentioned in your introduction. The current USF surcharge, as most of our listeners probably know, is hovering around 30%. And that number is applied to all international and interstate telecommunications that end users buy. So all voice traffic, all Ethernet connections, your high-speed data connections that aren't just plain old best efforts internet access. All of that is literally 30% more expensive than it should be because the commission just hasn't gotten around to fixing a funding system that has been failing for at least a decade. And the FCC has some obvious solutions that have been presented for them to fix the problem, but they have just actively avoided doing anything about it, even though they acknowledge it's a terrible problem. Honestly, it's just been a huge and inexcusable dereliction of their responsibility to administer the USF program. And of course, until there's a working majority on the commission, as we were just talking about, we wouldn't expect to see any action at all on this, let alone the major action that is needed to fix the problem.
Sara, given the huge costs to end users, it really is amazing that they just continue to ignore the problem and don't do anything about it. So what else aren't they doing?
Well, there's also the mother of all controversial issues, net neutrality, which has really become Exhibit A in terms of partisan rulemaking. After years of slowly ratcheting up the rules to prevent the large ISPs from manipulating their total control over last mile access, the Commission finally adopted some pretty strict net neutrality rules in 2015, on a 3-2 vote then, of course. Those rules contained key protections for our business clients because they prevented the ISPs from holding their customers, which are also our clients' customers, captive to throttling or paid prioritization. Basically, ways for the ISP to not only collect revenue from the subscriber of their service, but to also cash in by charging businesses that need to interact with their customers additional fees so that those businesses wouldn't have their data traffic blocked or throttled.
And those rules, which, as Sara pointed out, were so long in coming and evolved over time as it became clear that ISP manipulation of their monopoly of that last mile was a real risk. Those rules adopted in 2015 were eliminated in 2017 by the commission as soon as there was a change in presidential administrations. And of course, that elimination of the rules was also on a partisan 3-2 vote. So it was just a total flip-flop. Once those rules were eliminated, businesses were again vulnerable to manipulation by ISPs.
And the absurdity only continues because the current chair publicly committed to returning to the issue and reinstating net neutrality rules. But it's been pretty clear that to do so would require another 3-2 vote. And as mentioned, that's just not going to happen anytime soon.
I see what you mean about how little seems to get done with this back and forth on issues.
This dysfunction really just creates a lot of problems for everyone. Without an effective regulator, you really don't have a way to ensure that the regulated entities stay in line. And that has a big impact on things like service providers' obligations to protect customer data and to engage in fair pricing and reasonable practices, which in turn impacts end users' abilities to have their disputes resolved effectively.
And even the regulated entities like the traditional network service providers don't really benefit from this because the instability and uncertainty in the regulatory environment kind of unsettles them. It causes them to act weirdly at the negotiating table because they become very risk averse, sometimes about really simple issues. And that becomes hugely challenging for their business customers who are trying to engage them in substantive competitive negotiations.
Okay, we are out of time. Thank you, Andrew, and thank you as well, Sara. I really do appreciate you both sharing these insights. and for not screaming. If you would like to find out more about regulatory issues going on in Washington that affect enterprise customers, just reach out to Andrew and Sara directly. Now, I should say these guys represent a really interesting group of business customers of ICT. They work on policy issues and regulations to ensure that members are able to buy services in competitive markets with choices of vendors offering competitive prices. It's called the Ad Hoc Telecom Users Committee, and I'm certain that they'd be happy to discuss how your company might fit in. And you can also reach out to me or any of my colleagues at LB3 and TC2, and we can also get you the information that you need. Finally, you can stay up to date by subscribing to Staying Connected, by checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.